The 24th of March, 1944. Cold rain over Stalag Luft III, eastern Germany. A British sergeant named William Davies stood at morning roll call, his stomach knotted with hope and dread, counting the seconds until the guards finished counting heads. His best friend, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Ashford, had crawled into the escape tunnel the night before. 23 hours had passed. No alarm had sounded. No dogs had barked. No shots had been fired. Will told himself it meant success. Tommy had made it. He was free, running through the German countryside toward Switzerland, toward home, toward his wife and daughter in Surrey. But when the camp commandant's car pulled through the gates at dawn, something strange happened. No celebration, no announcement, just the sound of boots on gravel and a German officer walking slowly toward the barracks with a folder under his arm. Will didn't understand. None of the prisoners did. These were their friends. Why were the guards looking at them with something that looked like pity instead of anger? That moment would change everything he believed about escape, about freedom, and about what the price of hope really costs. Because inside that folder were photographs, 50 photographs, and what they showed would shatter not just one man's faith, but an entire camp's understanding of what happens when desperate men dig toward daylight. Stay till the end to see how one British sergeant's relief became the darkest truth of World War II, and how a friend's escape became a massacre that would haunt the survivors forever. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to support our channel and help us tell more forgotten stories of history that deserve to be remembered. It was the second week of October, somewhere over the Ruhr Valley. The sky was black and full of flak. The smell of burning oil and cordite filled the cramped fuselage. William Davies, a 28-year-old RAF wireless operator from Cardiff, had been flying bombing missions for 11 months. The Halifax bomber beneath him shuddered with each explosion. His crew was silent, focused, terrified. When the tail section exploded, there was no time to think. The plane tilted hard, spinning toward Earth. Will shouted into the radio, "Mayday! We're going down!" He counted 3 parachutes against the dark sky. Then he pulled his own ripcord and felt the violent jerk as the silk caught air. The ground came fast. He hit a ploughed field somewhere in western Germany, his shoulder dislocating on impact. Pain shot through his arm like lightning. He lay still for a moment, breathing hard, the smell of wet earth and smoke filling his nose. Above him, the sky glowed orange where his plane had crashed. He had grown up hearing that German soldiers shot air crews on sight, that capture meant torture or death. RAF briefings had shown photographs of burned bodies, warned them never to surrender if they could help it. So when he heard the dogs barking in the distance, his first thought was simple: hide. He tried to run. The pain in his shoulder made him gasp. He stumbled through the mud, his parachute dragging behind him. The dogs grew louder. Voices shouted in German. He reached for the small knife in his flight jacket, not to fight, but to cut his own throat if they caught him. The irony came fast. The German soldiers who surrounded him didn't shoot. They moved like professionals, checking for weapons, calling for a medic. One corporal, his face young and tired, knelt beside him and said in broken English, "Is okay. War is over for you now." Will didn't believe it. Not yet. They loaded him onto a truck. The engine's diesel roar mixed with the moans of other captured airmen. The smell of blood and canvas filled the air. Will stared at his dislocated shoulder, the arm hanging at an odd angle, and realized the war was no longer something he controlled. It was happening to him now. For the first few hours, pain was stronger than fear. He waited for the beating that never came. The Germans brought him to a field hospital, where a doctor, speaking careful English, reset his shoulder with practiced efficiency. They gave him water, bread, even morphine for the pain. No interrogation, no torture, no rifle barrels pressed against his head. He heard one of the prisoners whisper, "They're following the rules." Another replied, "Wait until we get to the camp." That night, a translator came by with forms. He spoke gently, asking Will's name, rank, serial number. Nothing more. When Will asked where they were taking him, the translator said simply, "Stalag Luft III. It's a camp for RAF officers and NCOs." The translator, an older man with sad eyes, added quietly, "You will be treated according to Geneva Convention. You have my word." Will didn't know it then, but that promise would prove both true and meaningless. Outside, trucks rumbled endlessly carrying captured airmen toward camps across Germany. By late 1943, more than 10,000 British and American flyers were prisoners in German hands. Many were wounded, exhausted, and terrified. Few had ever imagined surviving to become prisoners. When Will was loaded onto a train the next day, he sat beside other RAF men who had also been shot down. One of them, a pilot with burn scars on his hands, said, "I heard they shoot escapers." Another replied, "Geneva Convention says they can't." But a third man, older and quieter, said, "Geneva Convention says a lot of things. Doesn't mean they follow them all." At night, Will couldn't sleep. The train swayed through darkness. He thought of his wife in Cardiff, about the telegram she'd received marked "missing in action," about whether she'd believe he was still alive. He prayed quietly, not for rescue, but for endurance. When the train finally reached Silesia, the forest stretched grey and endless. They were told that under the Geneva Convention of 1929, they would be protected, given food, shelter, and fair treatment. Will didn't understand what that meant yet, but he saw order where he expected chaos. On the morning they arrived at Stalag Luft III, he looked at the rows of wooden barracks, the wire fences, the guard towers, and the faces of men who had been prisoners for months or years. Young, tired, defiant. And he realized the war he had been fighting had already changed. The battle now was not against the Germans outside the wire. It was against time, boredom, and the slow erosion of hope. But this was only the beginning. The camp arrived at Stalag Luft III on a cold October morning in 1943. The compound was surrounded by double barbed wire fences and watchtowers, grey wooden barracks stretching in neat rows. Smoke rose from stoves, and the air smelled of pine and coal dust. Will stood at the gate with a dozen other new arrivals, his shoulder still aching, watching as German guards checked papers and counted heads. Behind him, men whispered prayers or stood in silence. They had been told Stalag Luft III was one of the good camps, where the Germans followed the rules, where Red Cross parcels arrived regularly. But standing at those gates, nothing felt good. It felt like the end of everything. When the gates opened, guards directed them toward the processing building. Will's boots touched the wooden steps and the boards creaked under his weight. He expected to be shouted at, maybe searched roughly. But the guards spoke calmly, using short commands. "Higher, schnell, weiter." They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. Inside the building, the smell of wood smoke and boiled cabbage filled the air. Each prisoner was given a numbered tag, checked for injuries, and inspected by a medical officer. When Will's turn came, a German doctor examined his shoulder, testing the range of motion. "Healing well," the doctor said in accented English. "No more flying for you, I think." It wasn't cruel, just factual. They were sent to the north compound, rows of wooden huts with double bunks and small stoves. The journey took minutes. From the truck, Will watched other prisoners moving between barracks, some playing football, others reading or talking in small groups. It looked almost normal, almost like a military base, except for the wire and the guns. Inside the barracks, the floors were swept. The bunks had thin mattresses and wool blankets. Will's group was led to Hut 104, where they'd spend the rest of the war. They were given soup, black bread, and instructions. Morning roll call, work details, medical checks, lights out. Everything had rules. Everything followed a schedule. Even escape attempts, one prisoner told him quietly, followed rules. "Geneva says we have a duty to try," the man explained. "And the Germans know it. They expect it. It's a game we all play. On his first evening, Will met the senior British officer, Group Captain Massey, who explained how the camp worked. The prisoners organised themselves, ran their own kitchens, their own classes, even their own courts for disputes. The Germans provided the wire and the rules. Everything inside was British. "We're still RAF," Massey said firmly. "We still have discipline. We still have purpose." That night, Will lay awake, listening to the wind outside and the sound of men breathing in the darkness. Every noise made him tense. He whispered to himself, "This isn't forever. Somehow, this ends." But he didn't know how. Weeks passed. No beatings, no starvation, no torture. Instead, he saw men teaching each other languages, building radios from scraps, forging documents in hidden workshops. He saw order and ingenuity, things that kept them human. One afternoon, he received his prisoner number and a Red Cross parcel. Inside were cigarettes, chocolate, and tinned food, luxuries he hadn't seen in months. The tag said Geneva Convention, Article 72. That phrase began to mean something. It meant rules existed, even in captivity, even in war. But his real education came from the man in the bunk next to his. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Ashford, a pilot from Surrey, 26 years old, with a wife named Helen and a daughter he'd never met. Tommy had been in the camp for 8 months, and Tommy believed, more than anyone Will had ever met, that escape was not just possible but necessary. The friendship started simply. Tommy shared his Red Cross chocolate. Will helped him with wireless theory for a fake radio they were building. They talked about home, about families, about what they'd do when the war ended. Tommy showed Will a photograph of his wife, young and smiling, holding a baby. "Sarah," Tommy said quietly, "born 3 months after I was shot down. I've never held her." Will understood. He had a wife too, no children yet, but plans for them. Dreams that felt impossibly distant now. Tommy was different from the other prisoners. Most men settled into the routine, making the best of captivity. But Tommy couldn't settle. He paced the compound, studied the guards' schedules, talked constantly about getting home. "Every day here is a day stolen," he'd say. "Every day I'm not with Helen and Sarah is a day I'll never get back." By January 1944, Tommy had joined the Escape Committee. Stalag Luft III had one of the most sophisticated escape organisations in any POW camp. Engineers, forgers, tailors, all working in secret to help men get home. They called it the X organisation. And their most ambitious project was 3 tunnels being dug beneath the camp. Tom, Dick and Harry. Tommy worked on Harry, the tunnel that ran under Hut 104. Will helped when he could, disposing of dirt, keeping watch, covering for men who disappeared underground for hours. The work was dangerous. The tunnels could collapse, guards could discover them, but the men kept digging. By March, Harry was nearly complete, 300 feet long, running under the wire toward the forest. The plan was to get 200 men out in a single night, the greatest escape in the war. Tommy was number 17 on the list, one of the first to go. Will was too new, too low on the seniority list. He'd stay behind. "When you get out," Will told him one night, "find my wife. Tell her I'm alive. Tell her I'm okay." Tommy nodded. "I will. I promise." They shook hands, and Will felt something twist in his chest. Pride and envy and fear all mixed together. The escape was set for March 24th. A moonless night. Cold but clear. Will helped Tommy pack his escape kit, civilian clothes, forged papers, a compass hidden in a button, chocolate and biscuits for the journey. Tommy's hands shook as he dressed. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Good," Will said. "Means you'll be careful." At 9 p.m, the escape began. Men crawled into the tunnel entrance, hidden beneath a stove in Hut 104. One by one, they disappeared into the earth. Tommy turned back once before descending. "See you in England, mate." "See you in England," Will replied. Then Tommy was gone. Will lay in his bunk, unable to sleep, counting the minutes. By midnight, 50 men had gone through. By 2 a.m., 70. No alarms, no searchlights, no shots. It was working. Will's heart pounded with hope. They were doing it. They were actually getting out. But at 4:47 a.m., everything changed. A guard discovered the tunnel exit in the forest. Shots were fired. Searchlights blazed. The alarm siren wailed across the compound like a dying animal. Will sat up, his stomach dropping. Caught. They'd been caught. But how many had made it out before the discovery? 50? 70? Maybe Tommy had been far enough ahead. Maybe he was already miles away. The next morning at roll call, the guards counted again and again. 76 men were missing. 76 had escaped into the German night. The camp erupted in quiet celebration. It was the largest escape of the war. And Tommy was out there. Free. Running toward home. Will told himself to be happy. His best friend had made it. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, he felt something else. The terrible certainty that this wasn't over, that something worse was coming. He just didn't know how much worse until the commandant arrived with the folder. The guards came 3 days later. No warning, no explanation. They assembled all the prisoners in the compound and made them stand in formation, while the camp commandant, Oberst von Lindeiner, walked slowly between the ranks. His face was ashen. His hands trembled slightly as he held a manila folder. Will stood at attention, his heart hammering. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Von Lindeiner stopped in the centre of the compound. He opened the folder and began to speak in German. A translator repeated his words in English. On the night of March 24th, 76 prisoners escaped from this camp. As of today, 73 have been recaptured. A murmur ran through the prisoners. 73 recaptured. That meant only 3 had made it to freedom. The odds had been brutal. But recaptured wasn't executed. Recaptured meant they'd be back soon, maybe after some time in cooler cells, but alive. Von Lindeiner continued, his voice strained. I have been ordered to inform you that 50 of the recaptured prisoners have been shot while resisting arrest or attempting to escape custody. The words didn't register at first. Shot. 50. Will's mind went blank. Beside him, another prisoner whispered, No, that's not possible. Von Lindeiner's voice cracked. I am deeply sorry. This was not the Wehrmacht. This was Berlin. This was the Gestapo. He held up the folder. I have here the names of the dead. The compound went silent. Not the silence of discipline, but the silence of shock, of men unable to process what they were hearing. 50 men, murdered, not in combat, not in escape attempts, murdered after they'd been captured, in cold blood. Will's legs felt weak. He thought of Tommy, number 17 on the list, one of the first out. Surely he'd made it further than most. Surely he'd escaped before the tunnel was discovered. Surely... Von Lindeiner began reading names. Flight Lieutenant Roger Bushell, Flight Lieutenant Bernard Scheidhauer, Squadron Leader James Katernach. Will stopped hearing the words. His ears filled with a rushing sound like wind or water. Tommy's face flashed through his mind. The photograph of his wife and baby daughter. The promise to tell Will's wife he was alive. Von Lindeiner's voice continued. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Ashford. The world tilted. Will's knees buckled. Someone caught him before he fell. Tommy. Tommy was dead, shot by the Gestapo, murdered. The camp exploded in rage and grief. Men shouted, cursed, wept. Guards raised their rifles nervously. But von Lindeiner just stood there, the folder hanging from his hand, looking like a man who had aged 20 years overnight. Later, in the barracks, Will learned the details. The Gestapo had shot the escapers in small groups, 2 or 3 at a time, claiming they'd tried to run or fight. But the prisoners knew the truth. It was murder, Hitler's personal order, revenge for the embarrassment of the escape. A message to every Allied prisoner: try to escape and we will kill you. Tommy had been shot near Görlitz, 80 miles from the camp. He'd been caught at a train station, travelling with forged papers, claiming to be a French worker. The Gestapo had taken him to a car, driven him to a field, and put a bullet in the back of his head. He'd never resisted, never fought, he'd just been executed. Will sat on his bunk, holding the photograph Tommy had shown him. Helen and baby Sarah, smiling, waiting, not knowing yet that they'd be waiting forever. The camp descended into mourning. Services were held, prayers were said, men carved a memorial from scrapwood and planted it near the wire. 50 names, 50 friends, 50 men who had died trying to go home. And Will sat in his bunk, night after night, staring at that photograph, thinking the same thought over and over. I told him to go. I helped him pack. I promised to cover for him. I sent my best friend to his death. The guilt was worse than the grief. During the day, Will went through the motions: roll call, meals, work details, but inside, he was hollowed out. Other prisoners tried to comfort him. It wasn't your fault. You didn't know. Tommy made his own choice. But Will couldn't believe them. He'd helped with the tunnel. He'd encouraged Tommy when doubt crept in. He'd shaken his hand and sent him into the darkness. One night, a priest who was also a prisoner sat beside him. You can't carry this alone, son. I sent him to die, Will said, his voice flat. You sent him to try to live, the priest corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Will looked at him. He's dead, either way. The priest had no answer for that. By May, the shock had hardened into something else. Anger. Not just at the Germans, though God knew there was plenty of that, but anger at the war itself, at the senselessness of it all, at the fact that good men like Tommy could die not in battle, but murdered after surrender. The senior British officer, Group Captain Massey, called a camp meeting. He stood before them, his face grave. What happened to our brothers was a war crime, he said. When this war ends, and it will end, there will be a reckoning. The men responsible will face justice. Some prisoners nodded. Others looked sceptical. Justice felt like a fairy tale when you were behind wire. Massey continued, but until then, we have a duty to survive, to remember, to ensure that the world knows what happened here. He paused, and to never let the bastards break us. The compound erupted in cheers. It was defiance, pure and raw. But it didn't bring Tommy back. Will began writing. Every night, by the light of a small lamp, he wrote everything he could remember about Tommy. His jokes, his fears, his dreams, the way he talked about his daughter. The determination in his eyes when he climbed into that tunnel. He wrote it all down on scraps of paper, hiding them in his bunk, determined that someday, somehow, Tommy's family would know what kind of man he'd been. The camp continued. Life went on, as it always does, even in the worst circumstances. But something had broken. The escape attempt stopped. Not officially, but practically. No one had the heart for it anymore. The price had been made terrifyingly clear. By autumn, news filtered in from the outside world. The Allies had landed in France. The Soviets were pushing from the east. The war was turning. Liberation might actually come. Will allowed himself to hope, cautiously, that he might survive to tell Tommy's story. That Helen and Sarah might hear about their husband and father from someone who knew him, who loved him, who had watched him walk into darkness believing in freedom. The camp was evacuated in January 1945 as Soviet forces approached. The prisoners were marched west through snow and ice, hundreds of miles, with minimal food and no shelter. It was brutal. Men died from cold, exhaustion, disease. But Will survived. He carried Tommy's photograph the entire way, pressed against his chest, keeping it dry, keeping it safe. When American forces finally liberated them in April 1945, Will was 30 pounds lighter, sick with pneumonia, barely able to stand. But he was alive. The journey home began on a bright May morning. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. Will stood on a British transport ship, watching the continent recede into the distance. He felt nothing. No relief, no joy. Just emptiness. When the ship reached England, crowds cheered at the docks, families reunited, men kissed wives and held children. Will walked through it all like a ghost. At the processing centre, an officer asked, "Where are you from?" "Cardiff," Will said. "Family there." "A wife." Lucky man. Will said nothing. They gave him new clothes, back pay, and a train ticket home. As the train rolled through the English countryside, green and untouched by war, Will stared out the window and thought about Tommy, who would never see this, whose daughter would grow up without ever knowing her father. When he reached Cardiff, his wife Margaret was waiting on the platform. She ran to him crying, holding him so tight he could barely breathe. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed. "I thought I'd lost you." "You didn't," he said quietly, "but I lost someone." That night, in their small house, he told her everything. The camp, the tunnel, the escape, the murders. Tommy's face when he climbed down into the earth, the commandant reading names. Margaret listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. When he finished, she said, "You have to tell his family." "I know," Will said, "but I don't know how." By June, Will had tracked down Tommy's address. A small house in Surrey, white with a blue door. He stood outside for 10 minutes, trying to find the courage to knock. Finally, he did. The door opened. A young woman stood there, thin and tired, with a toddler on her hip. Helen. She looked at him, her expression confused. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Ashford." Will's voice cracked. I was with your husband, in the camp." Her face changed. Hope and fear and grief all at once. "You knew Tommy?" "Yes." The word came out as a whisper. "I was his friend." She invited him in. They sat in a small kitchen while Sarah, now nearly 2 years old, played with wooden blocks on the floor. Will told Helen everything he could remember. How Tommy had talked about her every day, how he'd shown everyone her photograph, how brave he'd been, how determined to get home. He told her about the tunnel, about the escape, about the hope they'd all felt that night. And then, because she deserved the truth, he told her about the murders, about the Gestapo, about the field near Görlitz. Helen didn't cry. She just sat very still, staring at her hands. "Finally," she said. "Did he suffer?" Will thought about lying. But Tommy deserved better than that. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I hope not. I pray not." Helen nodded slowly. Then she looked at Sarah, who was stacking blocks and laughing. "She'll never remember him." "No," Will agreed. "But you can tell her about him. And I can too, if you want. I can tell her what kind of man he was." Helen met his eyes. "Would you?" "For the rest of my life," Will promised. And he kept that promise. For the next 40 years, Will visited Helen and Sarah regularly. He told Sarah stories about her father, about his courage, his kindness, his determination, about the man who dug toward freedom because he wanted so desperately to meet his daughter. Sarah grew up knowing her father not as an absence, but as a hero. In 1947, the trial began. The Nuremberg Tribunal investigated the murders of the 50 escapers. The Gestapo officers responsible were hunted down, tried, convicted. Some were executed, some imprisoned. Group Captain Massey testified, so did other survivors. The world learned about the Stalag Luft III murders, about Hitler's order, about the cold-blooded execution of prisoners of war. Justice was served, as much as justice ever can be when the dead stay dead. But Will found no satisfaction in it. Revenge didn't bring Tommy back. It didn't fill the hole his friend had left. By the 1950s, Britain had moved on. The war became history, commemorated but distant. But Will couldn't move on. He carried Tommy with him everywhere. In 1963, a film was made about the escape. The Great Escape, starring Steve McQueen and James Garner. Will watched it in a dark cinema, sitting beside Margaret. The film showed the tunnel, the escape, the recaptures, but it Hollywoodized the ending, suggesting some men made it to safety when most hadn't. As the credits rolled, Margaret asked, "How accurate was it?" "Accurate enough," Will said, "but they couldn't show the real ending. Too dark. No one wants to watch 50 men get murdered." They walked home in silence. That night, Will dreamed of Tommy climbing into the tunnel, turning back to wave, and then disappearing forever into the earth. He woke, crying. Margaret held him until dawn. Years later, when Will was old and grey, Sarah Ashford, now a grown woman with children of her own, invited him to a memorial service at the RAF church. A plaque was being unveiled. 50 names engraved in bronze, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Ashford among them. Will stood before the plaque, his hand trembling as he traced Tommy's name. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." But an old voice beside him said, "You did save him." Will turned. It was Massey, now ancient but still dignified. "I didn't," Will said. "He died." "No," Massey corrected. "He's remembered. Because of you. His daughter knows him. The world knows what happened. That's not nothing, Davies. That's everything." Will wanted to believe that. He wanted to think that remembering was enough, that telling the story mattered, that Tommy's death had meaning beyond senseless murder. But late at night, when he was alone with his thoughts, he still heard Tommy's voice. "See you in England, mate." And his own reply, "See you in England." A promise he'd kept, but not the way either of them had hoped. The war had taken everything from Will, his youth, his innocence, his faith that the world made sense. But it had given him something too, the burden of memory. The responsibility to tell the truth, the duty to ensure that men like Tommy Ashford were not forgotten. As Will stood at that memorial, surrounded by aging veterans and young families who had never known war, he understood something he couldn't have understood at 28. That survival wasn't about escaping the wire. It was about carrying the dead with you, honouring them with your continued living, making sure their stories outlived the men who killed them. He thought about all the prisoners who never made it home, the 50 murdered escapers, the men who died in the camps from disease or cold or despair, the ones whose names no one remembered, whose families never learned what happened, whose graves were unmarked or non-existent. And he made himself a promise, the same promise he'd been keeping for 40 years. He would remember. He would tell the story. He would make sure that when people celebrated the Great Escape, they also mourned the Great Murder. Because Tommy and the 49 others hadn't died escaping. They died after they'd been captured. Murdered by a regime so evil it couldn't even follow the rules of war it had signed. The plaque gleamed in the afternoon sun. 50 names, 50 men, 50 families destroyed. Will reached out and touched Tommy's name one last time. "I kept my promise, mate," he whispered. "Helen knows. Sarah knows. The world knows. You're not forgotten." And in that moment, standing in the church with sunlight streaming through stained glass, Will finally felt something he hadn't felt in 40 years. Not peace exactly, not forgiveness, but perhaps a kind of rest. Tommy was gone, but his memory lived. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Will walked out of the church, Margaret took his hand. "Are you all right?" "No," he said honestly. "But I will be." Because he understood now what Tommy had understood in that tunnel. That some choices have to be made even knowing they might destroy you. That freedom is worth pursuing even when the cost is terrible. That hope, even desperate hope, even hope that ends in a field near Görlitz with a bullet in your head, is still better than giving up. Tommy had died free. Not physically, but in his heart. He died trying to get home to his family, fighting against captivity until the very end. And that mattered. That meant something. Will carried that truth with him for the rest of his life, in the stories he told, in the memorials he attended, in the letters he wrote to Sarah as she grew up, married, had children of her own. In the quiet moments when he closed his eyes and saw his friend's face, young and hopeful, turning back one last time before descending into darkness. "See you in England, mate." They'd both made it to England, just not together, and not the way they'd dreamed. But they'd made it, and Will would spend every remaining day of his life making sure Tommy's journey wasn't for nothing.